The night sky was filled with fire as ships burned above the planet. The war had come without warning and no one had been ready. Villages were torn apart, cities turned to dust, and the screams of people mixed with the sound of alien engines. Among the chaos stood a young soldier, a human named Arik, who never thought his simple life would lead him into the center of such a storm. He had been sent with others to fight on the outer edge of the battlefield. At first, it felt like survival was the only goal. He swung his blade against creatures with glowing eyes, their bodies made of strange armor and steel. Each strike shook his arms, but he refused to fall. The ground itself seemed to shiver beneath the weight of war, and the air carried the smell of blood and fire. Arik had heard stories about the alien lords who ruled with cruelty. They took lands, enslaved people, and demanded tribute in the form of bodies and chains. But no story could match the truth he saw with his own eyes. Columns of captives were dragged across the battlefield, women and men alike, their chains clinking as the aliens laughed. It was a sight that made his heart heavy with rage. When his unit was broken, Arik found himself alone among the ruins of stone walls. He wandered through smoke and shadow, blade in hand, searching for any sign of his people. His breath was sharp, his legs weak, but he moved forward. In the silence of burning ruins, he heard a voice. It was soft, trembling, but carried a strange strength. He followed the sound until he found her. A young alien woman knelt in the center of shattered stones, her skin glowing faintly blue under the broken moonlight. Her wrists were bound with chains, her ankles locked, and her hair fell wild across her shoulders. She lifted her head slowly when she saw him. Her eyes were not like the others he had fought. They were filled with sorrow, fear, and something else that felt almost human. Arik froze, unsure if this was a trap. His blade remained in his grip, but his heart told him she was different. The chains around her glowed faintly, as if made from both metal and light. She whispered words in a language half known to him. He understood only pieces, but enough to know she was begging. She was not begging for life. She was begging for freedom. He stepped closer, the ground crunching under his boots. His hand reached out to the glowing chains, but the air around them sparked as if warning him. The girl shook her head and tears ran down her cheeks. She said with trembling lips that freeing her would not only break her prison, it would break a law of her people, a law older than war itself. Arik's breath grew heavy as he looked at her. She was beautiful, fragile, and yet there was power hidden inside her that he could not explain. He thought about the stories told around fires, stories of ancient brides given in chains to those who defied the alien lords. His hand touched the chain despite her warning. In that moment her eyes widened and her voice cut through the smoke. She whispered that now they would come for him too. Arik pulled back his hand as the chains sparked with light. The glow spread, along the links like fire racing across dry wood. The girl gasped, and her eyes darted to the shadows around them. Her lips trembled as she told him that the hunters would already know. By touching the chains, he had broken their silence. He had marked himself in their law. He could not understand how one act could summon such danger. Yet her fear was real, and the way her voice shook made his heart pound. The chains were more than metal. They carried signals, perhaps magic, perhaps alien craft far beyond his knowledge. His people had fought machines and soldiers, but never living symbols like these. Now his breath grew heavier as he realized he had crossed a line he did not see. The girl lowered her head and whispered her name. It was soft and strange, but it carried warmth. Arik spoke it clumsily, and she looked at him with sudden surprise. No human had spoken her name in years. Her people had been enslaved by their own kind, turned into offerings, chained and given as symbols of obedience. She was one of many brides promised to lords who never freed them. Her chains were her curse. And her cage. Arik clenched his sword. He had never cared for the politics of kings or the power of lords. He had lived for survival, for defending his home, for fighting to keep his people alive. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something worth more than orders. She was not his enemy. She was a prisoner of the same hands that had crushed his world. He could not turn away now. The air shifted suddenly and a sound rose from the distance. It was like the cry of beasts, mixed with the grinding of stone. The girl's body stiffened. She whispered that the hunters were coming. They would not let her chains be touched by human hands. They would not allow him to leave alive. Arik gritted his teeth, knowing the battle was not done. His hand went to the hilt of his sword again. Out of the smoke and ash, shapes began to move. Dark figures with armor like bone, eyes glowing with green fire, and blades that shimmered like liquid. Their steps echoed through the ruins as they closed in. Arik stood tall, though his heart hammered. He was one man against many, but he had been in worse battles before. His legs shifted into stance, ready to meet them head-on. The alien girl tugged at her chains, her voice desperate. She told him to run, that he had no chance against the hunters. Yet Arik only shook his head. He had seen too much death to walk away from someone who needed him. His blade gleamed as he raised it, the broken light of burning ships reflecting on the steel. The hunters snarled as they spread out to surround him. The first one struck, leaping with a spear that hissed through the air. Arik twisted aside, his sword cutting upward with force. The clash rang like thunder. Sparks flew, and the hunter staggered back. The others hissed, their bodies moving unnaturally fast. Arik's arms burned as he fought, every strike pushing him closer to exhaustion. Still, he did not falter. Behind him, the girl's voice rose, calling his name, pleading for him. Not to die here. In the chaos, Arik realized something. The chains around her were not just a curse. They pulsed brighter each time he fought, as if feeding on the battle. The glow spread into the ground, sending lines of light through the stones. The girl cried out as the light grew, and the hunters hesitated. Fear showed in their glowing eyes for the first time. Whatever power her chains held, it was waking now. The ground shook as the hunters circled Arik. Their movements were sharp and unnatural, as if their bodies were made from both flesh and shadow. Each step echoed against the ruins, and the alien girl's chains glowed brighter. She pressed her forehead to the stone, her voice trembling as she begged him to stop. She said the chains were not his burden. Yet Arik did not step back. His eyes stayed fixed on the enemy before him. The first hunter came at him with a blade shaped like fire. Arik lifted his sword, and the clash of steel rang through the night. The impact sent pain through his arms, but he pushed back with fury. His strike cut across the hunter's chest, spilling sparks instead of blood. The creature shrieked and fell, but three more rushed forward. Arik's breath burned in his lungs, his strength tested against forces not of his world. The girl cried, out again. She told him the hunters could not be killed as mortals. They were bound to the chains as much as she was. Every wound he gave them fed into the light. Every strike made her prison stronger. Arik's heart clenched as he saw the glow rise from the ground. The hunters did not fear him. They feared what the chains were becoming. Still, he could not stop. His blade cut, his boots crushed stone, and his will held strong. The hunters pressed closer, their weapons flashing in arcs of green fire. Arik's body screamed with exhaustion, but his spirit burned with something fiercer than pain. He had fought wars, but never with the weight of another's freedom at stake. Behind him, the girl's eyes shone with both sorrow and awe. She saw him fight not as a conqueror, but as a man who refused to yield. One hunter leapt high, spear aimed for his heart. Arik twisted and slammed his sword upward, piercing the creature through its chest. The hunter dissolved into smoke, leaving nothing but its weapon behind. Another charged from the side, but Arik spun and struck with raw strength, sending it crashing into the stones. For a moment, silence fell. The girl lifted her head, her lips parting as if in disbelief. No human should have stood against them this long. The silence ended as the chains roared with light. A wave of energy pulsed outward, throwing dust and fire into the air. The hunters staggered, their forms shaking as if pulled by unseen hands. The girl screamed, clutching her wrists as the chains burned into her skin. Arik ran to her, dropping his sword to grasp the glowing links. His hands burned, but he pulled with all his strength. He refused to let her suffer while he stood alive. The The chains cracked and a sound like thunder split the air. The hunters wailed in fury, their bodies unraveling into mist. The girl collapsed into Arik's arms, her body trembling from the power that had been forced through her. Her eyes locked with his and her breath came in ragged bursts. She whispered that he had done what no other dared. He had broken the silence that bound her kind. Arik held her close, though the heat of the chains scorched his skin. He asked her what would happen now. Her lips shook as she tried to answer. She said the hunters were not the end. They were only the first. By breaking her chains, he had called the lords themselves. They would not stop. They would not forgive. And they would come for him as much as they would come for her. Her words weighed heavier than the chains themselves. Yet Arik did not look away. He saw the fear in her, but he also saw her freedom beginning to bloom like fire in the dark. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The hunters had fallen, but the true war was only beginning. Arik tightened his grip on his sword and whispered to her that she would never kneel again. The girl's breathing slowed as she leaned against Arik. Her chains had cracked but not fully broken. They still clung to her wrists and ankles like shadows of iron. The ground around them glowed faintly with the power that had burst free. Arik tightened his grip on his sword and listened. The night was too quiet. The hunters had vanished, but the silence itself felt like a trap. She raised her head and looked into his eyes. Her voice was weak but steady. She told him that once the hunters fell, the lords would awaken. They were not creatures of flesh but beings bound to law and power. The chains had been their mark of control. By touching them, Arik had shattered their hold, and now he bore a weight as heavy as hers. Her words were not warning but truth, spoken with sorrow and certainty. Arik did not regret his choice. He had seen fear consume soldiers and break armies, but he would not let it take him now. The girl's presence gave him strength, though she was the one in chains. He told her that if the lords came, he would stand against them. She lowered her gaze, whispering that no human had ever spoken such defiance and lived. Her fingers tightened around his arm, as if to anchor herself to his resolve. The air shifted again, this time colder. A low hum rose from the stones, vibrating through their bodies. Arik looked to the horizon where the ruins met the sky. Shapes formed in the distance, tall and cruel, with crowns of fire and cloaks of shadow. The lords had come, their arrival tearing the silence apart. The girl's face turned pale and she pressed her forehead to the ground. She whispered that it was too soon. The war had only just begun. The lords moved with grace unlike the hunters. Their forms shimmered between light and darkness, and their voices echoed without mouths. They spoke in a tongue that bent the air. Arik could not understand the words, but his heart felt their meaning. They condemned him for breaking the chains. They promised pain not only for him but for his entire kind. The girl flinched with every sound, her chains glowing again as if pulled toward their masters. Arik stepped forward, lifting his sword high. His voice rang louder than he thought possible. He told them that no master had the right to bind another in chains. He told them that he had fought armies of flesh and steel, and he would fight shadows just the same. The Lord's laughter filled the night, cold and endless. Yet his stance did not waver, his grip unbroken. He was one man, but he would not bend. The girl cried out, pulling at her chains. She warned him that their power was beyond mortal strength. The chains were not just bonds, but conduits to the heart of their law. Every link was tied to an empire of countless worlds. To cut them fully would be to declare war against all of it. Arik looked down at her, his face set in stone. He said that the war had already found him, and he would not walk away from it. The lords raised their arms, and the sky split with light. Energy poured down like rivers of fire, striking the ruins where Arik stood. He lifted his blade and braced, himself, the force crashing against him like a storm. The ground cracked, the air burned, yet he held. The girl's chains shook violently, and she screamed as sparks leapt from her skin. The clash was not only of steel and power, but of will itself. When the fire cleared, Arik was still standing, Smoke curled from his armor, his skin burned, but his sword remained in his hand. The lords hissed in disbelief, their forms flickering. They had expected him to break, yet he endured. The girl looked at him through her tears, her lips forming, words too soft for him to hear. Her chains glowed brighter than before, as if feeding on his defiance, as if answering his will with their own. Auric knew this was only the beginning. The hunters had been shadows and the lords were storms. More would come, greater than these. But his heart did not falter. He reached down and lifted the girl to her feet, his voice firm as he promised that she would not be a prisoner any longer. Her eyes widened as she felt the truth in his words. For the first time in years, hope touched her heart like fire in the dark. The lords retreated into the shadows of the sky, their forms fading like smoke carried by the wind. They had not been defeated, only tested. Their voices lingered in the air like a curse, promising that Auric and the girl would never find rest. Auric stood with his sword still raised, his chest heaving from the force he had endured. The ground around him was cracked and glowing, marked forever by their clash. The girl leaned on him, her body trembling as the chains dug into her skin once more. She whispered that he had defied what no other mortal dared. Yet her words carried no triumph. They carried fear. The lords would not forget, and they would not forgive. She told him that her chains were now bound to him as much as to her. Their fates had been tied together by fire and will. Auric looked at her with steady eyes. He did not fear being bound to her. He told her that freedom was worth any chain, even if it dragged him into endless battle. She lifted her gaze, her eyes shimmering like water under moonlight. No one had spoken to her like that, not even among her own kind. Her lips parted, but no words came, only the silent weight of disbelief and hope. The ruins grew colder as night deepened. Smoke drifted slowly, carrying the scent of burning stone. Auric guided her through the broken walls, searching for shelter. His body ached, his arms heavy, but he did not let her stumble. Each step was a reminder of the choice he had made, the choice to free her, the choice to fight, the choice to stand against the lords themselves. They found a hollow beneath fallen towers, where the fire did not reach. Auric set her down gently against the stone. He pulled a ragged cloth from his belt and wrapped it around her wrists, trying to ease the burn of the chains. She flinched at first, but let him work. Her eyes studied him in silence, as if weighing whether he was a savior or a fool. He said nothing, only let his hands speak through care. The silence stretched between them until she finally spoke. She told him her name again, slower this time, as if teaching him. Auric repeated it with care, and she closed her eyes as if the sound itself gave her peace. She revealed that she had once been promised as a bride not to a man but to the law itself. Her chains were not forged for marriage but for submission. She was meant to be a living symbol, never a living soul. Auric felt the weight of her story press against his chest. He had fought for villages, for armies, for nations, but never for a single life in this way. He told her that she was no symbol. She was a person, and no law could make her less. His words made her tremble, and for the first time she smiled, faintly, though pain still lined her face. That smile gave him strength more than any sword. Suddenly the ground quaked again. The glow in her chains pulsed brighter, filling the hollow with light. She gasped and clutched her wrists. Her voice broke as she said that the lords were pulling her back. Even from a distance they could summon her through the links. Auric's jaw tightened as he grabbed the chains with both hands. He swore that they would never take her again while he breathed. The light burned into his flesh, searing his skin, but he refused to let go. His muscles shook with the effort, his teeth gritted against the pain. The girl cried out, telling him it was impossible. But Auric only roared as he pulled, the sound echoing through the ruins. With a crack like thunder, the first link split in half. The glow burst outward and the sky itself seemed to shatter with it. The girl collapsed into his arms, her chains weaker now, their power broken further than before. She looked at him with wide eyes, unable to believe what he had done. No mortal had ever torn even one link apart. Yet he had done it with nothing but will. Auric held her close, his breath ragged, His skin blistered and his voice steady as he told her that no law was stronger than a man who chose to fight for another. The hollow shook with the sound of breaking stone as the chain's shattered link released its power. Dust rained down from above, and the girl clutched her wrists with wide eyes. She had never imagined a mortal could split even one bond. Arik stood over her, his hands bleeding, his chest rising and falling with ragged breath. Pain surged through his body, but there was no regret in his face. He had done what no other dared. The girl's voice trembled as she warned him of what he had unleashed. The lords would not stay silent after this. Each broken link was an insult to their rule, a defiance that spread across their empire like fire in dry grass. They would send more than hunters now. They would send armies, ships, and creatures forged from law itself. She begged him to leave her before the storm came. Arik only shook his head, his eyes unyielding. He told her that his choice was already made. He had fought against death before, but this fight meant more. This was not about survival. It was about freedom. She tried to argue, but his words silenced her. His resolve was stronger than any weapon. She had been chained for so long that she had forgotten the taste of defiance. Now, hearing it from a human, she felt something stir inside, her that she had thought lost forever. The night grew darker as clouds gathered above. The stars themselves seemed to vanish, hidden by a shadow spreading across the sky. A low hum rose from the horizon, deeper and heavier than thunder. The girl's face paled as she recognized the sound. It was the approach of the Lord's war machines. Arik tightened his grip on his sword, his knuckles white against the steel. His body ached, but his spirit burned hotter than the fire that filled the heavens. From the distance, ships descended, like falling stars. Their hulls glowed with alien symbols, each mark pulsing like a heartbeat. The ground trembled with their arrival, and the ruins shook as if the world itself feared them. The girl pressed herself against the stone, whispering that he must run while there was still a chance. Arik stood tall, planting his boots firmly into the cracked earth. He said he would not run from them, not now, not ever. The first of the machines touched down, its body towering over the ruins. It was shaped like a beast with legs of steel and eyes that burned with green fire. Weapons gleamed from its sides, and its roar split the air. Behind it, more shadows fell, each larger than the last. Arik's heart pounded, but his hand never wavered from his sword. He looked at the girl and told her that he had faced giants before, and he would face these too. She shook her head in disbelief. She whispered that courage alone could not win against the Lord's power. Yet her eyes betrayed something else. Hope. Hope that maybe he was different. Maybe he could do what none of her people had done. Arik caught that glimmer in her gaze and held it close. It was enough to keep him standing when most men would have fallen to their knees. The machines advanced, their steps shaking the ground like drums of war. Arik raised his sword, its edge gleaming in the faint light of the burning ruins. The girl clutched her chains, her lips moving in silent prayer. The machines opened their weapons, fire gathering at their mouths. Arik braced himself as the first blast roared forward. He leapt aside, rolling across the stone, and struck at the nearest leg with all his might. The clash rang like thunder, sparks flying into the air. The blade cut deep, and the machine stumbled with a roar. The girl gasped as she saw the impossible. A mortal blade piercing the armor of a war machine. The other machines shrieked with sound that tore the air. Arik stood again, his sword dripping with sparks, his body marked with burns and cuts, and his voice steady as he told them they would not take her. The battle had only begun, but something had changed. The girl looked at him and felt her chains tremble as if they too had heard his words. The power within them no longer belonged fully to the lords. Some of it had turned, pulled by his defiance, answering to his will. She realized with sudden awe that he was not just fighting for her freedom. He was reshaping the law that bound her kind, and for the first time, the lords themselves might be afraid. The machines moved forward in unison, their steps shaking the ruins apart. Each of them glowed with the same burning symbols that lived on the chains of the girl. Arik gritted his teeth as the ground split beneath him. He had fought enemies of flesh and blood, but these were storms of steel and fire. The girl cried out, telling him that to stand against them was to fight the very will of the lords. He answered with his sword raised high. The first machine roared, releasing a beam of searing green light. Auric threw himself to the side, the blast carving a crater where he had stood. Dust and fire filled the air, choking his lungs, but he did not falter. He rolled to his feet and charged, his sword striking with the strength of his rage. Sparks exploded as his blade bit into armor, cutting deeper than it should have. The machine staggered as if his will had broken its core. The girl's chains pulsed brighter with each strike. She watched with trembling hands as the glow spread through the broken ground. She whispered that his defiance was twisting the law itself. He was bending it, reshaping it, and the machines were weakening because of it. For the first time, she dared to hope that they could fall. Her voice grew louder as she called his name, begging him to strike again. Auric did not hesitate. He swung, his sword in wide arcs forcing the machines back. One collapsed under his fury, its legs buckling, its chest splitting open with fire. Another lunged at him, claws slashing like lightning, but he met it head-on. His blade rang against its strike, and with a roar he split its arm from its body. The ground shook with the force of his victory, but still more came. He stood against them like a wall of steel. The girl pressed her palms into the stone, her chains humming with power. She could feel the law resisting, trying to drag her back into silence. Yet Auric's strength bled into her through every broken link. She realized with shock that his will was not only his own. It was flowing into her, awakening something buried deep inside. She lifted her head, her eyes burning with light, and, for the first time, she pulled against the chains herself. The machines turned their fire on her. Beams of green light lanced across the ruins, aiming for the fragile form that dared resist. Auric leapt between them, his sword a shield of steel and fury. Fire struck him, but he held his ground. The blasts seared his skin, tore at his armor, but his stance did not break. The girl screamed his name as smoke curled from his shoulders. He roared back, driving his sword into the heart of another machine. The ruins glowed brighter as the battle raged. Broken stone rose into the air, drawn by the power flowing through the chains. The girl's voice carried through the chaos as she cried that the lords were watching. Their anger was pouring into the machines, yet still he stood. She shouted that no human should survive, no human should endure, and yet he did. Her tears fell as she realized that his defiance was becoming legend before her eyes. One final machine remained, towering above the rest. Its body shone like molten metal, and its roar shook the very stars above. Auric stood before it, his body broken, his breath ragged but his spirit unshaken. He raised his sword high, pointing it at the giant. The girl's chains erupted with fire, the glow racing along the links as if answering his challenge. Together their voices filled the night as they defied the lords with every breath they had. The machine struck with fury, its claws descending like mountains. Auric charged forward, leaping higher than his body should allow. His blade crashed into its chest, cutting deep as light poured outward. The ground exploded with the force, fire and smoke sweeping across the ruins. When the light cleared, the machine lay in pieces and Auric stood upon its broken frame. His sword dripped with sparks, his face scarred with fire, but his eyes burned with victory. The girl fell to her knees, her chains weaker than ever. She looked at him with awe, her lips trembling with words she could not form. She had been given to him as a prisoner, a symbol, a bride bound in silence. Now she saw something else. She saw the man who had turned law into dust and machines into ash. For the first time she believed the lords themselves could bleed, and she whispered that if they bled, they could fall. The battlefield was silent. After the last machine fell, smoke drifted into the night sky, and the ruins glowed with the dying light of fire. Auric stood among the wreckage, his sword heavy in his hand, his body trembling from wounds that burned across his skin. The girl watched him with wide eyes, her chains glowing faintly but weaker than ever. She had seen mortals fall for far less, yet here he stood like a storm-given flesh. She crawled to his side and touched his arm gently. Her voice was soft as she told him that what he had done would be remembered forever. No man had faced the Lord's machines and lived. No man had turned the chains of their law against them. Yet Arik had done it not for power, not for glory, but for her. Her heart beat faster as she realized she no longer felt like a prisoner. She felt alive again. Arik lowered himself beside her, his breath ragged. He looked at the chains still clinging to her wrists and ankles. Though many links had broken, some still held, glowing with defiance against his will. He pressed his hands against them, ignoring the pain as fire burned his skin. He told her that he would not stop until they were gone. She tried to protest, but her words failed. His determination crushed doubt itself. The chains screamed with light as his strength poured into them. Each link cracked like thunder, each break echoing across the ruins. The girl cried out, not from pain, but from the weight lifting off her soul. Her tears ran down her face as the chains shattered one by one. At last, with a final roar, the last link broke apart, bursting into dust that scattered into the wind. For the first time in her life, she was free. She fell into his arms, her body light as air. She whispered that he had done the impossible. Her people had waited generations for freedom, yet it had come from a human who should have had no part in their law. She told him that the lords would never forgive this, that they would come for him again and again. But Arik only smiled faintly through his exhaustion. He said that freedom was worth the fight. The night sky split open with fire as the lords' voices rose. Their wrath shook the heavens, their shadows burning like storms across the horizon. They promised war, they promised ruin, but their words carried something else: fear. For the first time in ages, they had been challenged and beaten. The girl clung to Arik, her heart steady despite the storm above. She whispered that the lords were no longer untouchable. They could be broken. Arik rose slowly, his sword dragging against the stone. He looked to the sky, his eyes steady. He shouted to the darkness that if the lords wanted war, then war they would have. His voice carried across the ruins, strong and unyielding. The girl lifted her face, her eyes glowing with light born from hope and fire. She no longer saw herself as a chained bride. She saw herself as his equal, standing beside him in defiance. The ruins glowed brighter as dawn began to rise. The first rays of sunlight broke across the battlefield, washing the smoke with golden light. The girl reached for his hand and he took it firmly. Together they stood, two souls bound not by chains but by choice. Around them, silence gave way to the cries of survivors who had watched from the shadows. They saw not just a man and an alien. They saw the beginning of rebellion. The lords would come again. Their wrath would sweep across worlds, their hunters would return, and their machines would rise. Yet something had changed forever. A human had touched their law and torn it apart. A prisoner had become free. The story would spread, and with it the truth that the lords could bleed. Fear would no longer bind the weak. Hope would rise instead. Arik tightened his grip on her hand, his sword resting at his side. He looked into her eyes, and she looked into his, their hearts beating as one. She whispered that they would hunt him until the end of his days. He answered without hesitation that they could hunt, but they would never win. Together, they stepped forward into the rising sun, no longer prisoner and soldier, but partners in a war that would change the stars.